Spacing the chords. The chords could, of course, be connected in a purely schematic way, whereby each chord is regarded as a mass that is followed by another such mass by another chord, as sometimes happens in piano pieces. The most important principle of harmonic connection, good progression, is not affected by this type of connection. However, as I mentioned earlier, since many chord connections are not of purely harmonic origins, but rather of melodic, it is necessary to connect the chords in such a way that the melodic influences have a chance to become evident. Therefore, the chords are presented as entities resulting from the concurrent movement of parts, but in so presenting them, one should not forget that the motor that drives this movement of voices, the motive, is absent. For presenting chord progressions through the movement of parts, since most harmonic events require an average of 4 parts, we use a combination of the 4 principal types of the human voice: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. With these, we obtain the so-called 4-part writing. This combination of human voices is just as practical as it is natural, as we shall see both now and later. Not only does it assure those acoustical distinctions that help to distinguish the parts clearly from one another, but it also affords that acoustical uniformity that at the same time makes it easy to hear the parts as a coherent whole, as chords. Even in the limitations of the individual voices, in their relative incompleteness, there are advantages. I am taking such pains with these things, not so much out of concern that the pupil might, if they were not explained, thoughtlessly accept and mechanically apply them, as to establish explicitly that these principles are not derived from aesthetics but from practical considerations. If what is known as aesthetics does in fact contain much that is merely practical handling of the material, and if what is known as symmetry is perhaps often not much more than an organization of the material that reveals a sensible regard for its properties, yet I consider it worthwhile to set down these observations. For the conditions of practicality can change if we take a different view of the material and if the purpose changes, but aesthetics alleges it has discovered eternal laws. The necessity for utilizing them within the narrow range of their effectiveness demands characteristic usage and treatment consistent with the material. Thus the pupil learns by this simple example to heed an important principle of handicraft, to make characteristic use of the strengths and shortcomings of the material at hand. The properties of the human voice relevant to our present task are as follows. Most instruments, moreover, reveal similar properties. There is a register in which every normal, healthy voice sings easily and without strain, the middle register, and there are 2 registers that demand more effort and cause more fatigue, the high and the low. The middle register sounds less expressive and less impressive than the high or low registers. Since, however, the presentation of harmonic connections is not so much concerned with these effects as with those that are purely harmonic, the following principle can be given for the treatment of the voices. This principle even conforms to a certain extent to common practice. In general, each voice is to sing in its middle register. Only as other conditions require, difficulties in voice leading, avoiding monotony, and so on, we will seek out the higher or the lower register. The range of the voices is, as far as this purely schematic treatment is concerned, approximately that indicated by the half notes. The quarter notes in parentheses indicate those tones at each extreme of the ranges that may be used in case of necessity. Obviously, the range of solo voices, yes, even of choral voices, is in reality larger than, perhaps different from, that indicated here, which only aims at a fairly correct average. The middle register, which should be the one chiefly used, lies a fourth or a fifth from the highest and lowest tones, so that we have. Of course, the pupil cannot get along with just the tones of the middle register, and will have to use some from the higher or lower registers. Naturally, at first only the adjacent tones, but then also on occasion the highest or lowest, if there is no other way. In general, however, he should seldom overstep to any significant degree the bounds of an octave. Whoever wants to write parts comfortable for the voice will avoid, even in actual composition, extended passages exclusively in one of the outer registers. The pupil should therefore enter these registers only for a short time and leave them as soon as possible. Whenever the treatment of solo or choral voices in practice indicates otherwise, it is because the composer sought some compositional or acoustical effects irrelevant to our present aims. The characteristics of the voices indicate the requirements, supported by experience, for their combination in choral writing. If no voice is to stand out, then all voices will seek out registers whose acoustical potential is approximately the same. For, were a voice to sing in a more brilliant register, while the others move in a duller register, that voice would naturally be quite noticeable. If this voice is intended to stand out, for example, when an inner voice has the melody, then it is well that it sing in a more expressive register. But if it is inadvertently conspicuous, then the director would have to rely on shading. He would have to create equilibrium by subduing the prominent voice or by strengthening the weaker ones. Since we are not yet concerned with motives or melodies, these problems would hardly be relevant here, were it not inherent in our task to use only those resources that fit the particular situation, that are absolutely necessary. To learn such economy can only benefit the pupil, both now and later. The chords can be spaced in close or in open position. The open position generally sounds mellow, the close position, on the average, sharper. The task of having to choose between these two effects will not be given the pupil while he is concerned with the purely schematic presentation of harmonic relations. Therefore, we need do no more here than affirm this distinction and proceed to use both positions without asking about the basis or purpose of their effects. Close position is defined as follows. The upper three voices all sing chord tones so spaced that no other chord tone can be inserted between two adjacent voices. The distance of the bass from the tenor is not considered so long as it is not too great. If among the three upper voices the tones sung by two adjacent voices are far enough apart that one or more chord tones can be inserted between them, then the chord is in open position, as this example shows. Experience teaches that an average balance in a chord is best achieved when no two adjacent voices of the upper three are separated by more than an octave at most, but the bass and tenor can be even farther apart. Of course, if other than this balanced effect is desired, a circumstance irrelevant to our present task, then the voices can and must be spaced differently. In the distribution of three chord tones among four voices, it becomes necessary to double one of the tones. The first to be considered is the root, also called fundamental, next the fifth, and only then, lastly, the third. This order of preference comes from the nature of the overtone series. If we want to imitate by synthesis the sound of the natural tone, that is, if we want to obtain a sound whose euphony recalls the euphony inherent in the material, then we must do something similar to what nature does. The sound is most similar to nature when the root, the tone that appears most frequently in the overtone series, also appears more often in the actual chord. For the same reason, the fifth is less suitable for doubling than the octave, the root, though more suitable than the third. The last named will be doubled less often, moreover, because it already stands out prominently as the determiner of the mode, major or minor. Since acoustical effects and others not exclusively harmonic do not come under consideration here, we will always construct our chords with just that doubling which is necessary. Therefore, since here, at first, the doubling of the fifth and third is superfluous, we shall restrict ourselves to the doubling of the octave, the root. And here's example 6. In example 6, the triad on the first degree of C major is presented in various forms of open and closed position. The pupil's first exercise is to write, in the same manner, the triads on 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 7 is omitted for the time being. Adhering to the suggested voice registers, he should then repeat this procedure in some other keys. The exercises are to be notated on 2 staves with the treble and bass clefs. It is best for the pupil to write the soprano and alto parts on the upper staff, the treble clef, the tenor and bass on the lower, the bass clef. Often, or depending on individual circumstances, the tenor may be included on the upper staff, in which case the bass stands alone on the lower. The range of the tenor is that notated in example 3 in the bass clef. The adjacent notes in parentheses in the treble clef refer to the manner of notation generally practiced in lieder, operas, choral music, and so on, where the notes in the treble clef are read down an octave. The notation in our exercises approximates that used in piano scores, where the tenor notes, whether they appear in the bass or the treble, always sound as written, that is, as if they were written for the piano rather than for voice, without the octave transposition. Often, or depending on individual circumstances, the tenor may be included on the upper staff, in which case the bass stands alone on the lower. The examples will be given here largely in C major. Nevertheless, the pupil must always do an exercise, once mastered in the original key, in other keys as well. Otherwise, these will remain foreign to him. Here we should mention also the method of the so-called thorough bass, or figured bass, a kind of musical shorthand that was formerly used to give the harpsichordist the harmonic skeleton of the work. This skeleton he translated into sound by improvisation, filling in and filling out the harmonies indicated. For this purpose, figures were written below the bass line which expressed schematically the intervals between the lowest tone, the bass, and the other tones of the chord, but without indicating whether the interval lay in the same or in a higher octave. Thus, for example, the figures 3, 5, 7 merely indicated the schematic order of the chord components in their closest position, but one or more octaves could be added to 3, 5, or 7. The figure 3 meant there was a third above, in some octave or other. 5 meant there was a fifth above, 7 a seventh, 9 a ninth, 6 a sixth, in some octave or other. Whether in performance the tones had the order 3, 5, 7, 5, 3, 7, or 7, 3, 5, or yet another, was left to the judgment of the harpsichordist, whose decision was based on necessities of voice leading. The chords were formed from tones of the scale corresponding to the key signature, unless there was a special sign, sharp, flat, or natural, beside a figure. A triad in root position, whose symbol would have been 5/3, was left unfigured. If, however, a figure 8, 5, or 3 appeared with a bass note, it meant that the highest voice, in our case the soprano, should take the 8, 5, or 3. The chord is then said to be in octave position, fifth position, or third position.